Jimmy Swift had earned his name. He had been the fastest runner in his street gang, always one step ahead of the guards. He would always bring back his spoils to the lower city pub and share them in secret with the owner. He would tell stories of his narrow escapes to the amusement of the regulars. That is until he got ambushed by the guards. He was roughed up and thrown out of town. He had tried to start his operation again in other towns, but due to his previous bragging, his reputation had spread. Each town found him out faster than the last, and each time he had been kicked out, chased out, or in one case, paraded around as a fool. His latest unwilling expedition took him to an abandoned mining town. It was desperate, and he suspected the old prospector was making it up. Still, it was all he had to go on. The story was of a flower made of glowing gemstones that had grown deep in the cave. Miners had seen the glow from a distance and had tried to track down the source. Everyone who went never came back. Then other flowers started to grow in the mine until you could see the glow from outside the cave itself. There was a rumor that for each person who explored the mine and never came back, another flower bloomed. The town had been abandoned shortly after due to the cursed flowers. Jimmy Swift arrived at the place close to dusk. The village was small, with only a few wooden houses and a small pub with a roof that had caved in. He examined all the buildings, hoping to find something. After a long time searching, he found one gold coin suspiciously bright amongst the dust on the floor of the pub. Jimmy frowned and picked it up. He turned it over in his hand. It felt like any coin should. All the markings were there too. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something special about this coin. He placed it in his pocket and turned to look at the mine and let out a gasp. There was a faint glow emanating from the cave's mouth. Jimmy Swift hurried to the mouth of the cave and peered inside. The glow intensified inside, and there seemed to be a faint tingling noise, but it could have been his imagination. He instinctively looked to the floor for tripwires and laughed at himself before he continued. He could see abandoned mining equipment scattered on the floor. The path was more narrow ahead, and he had a sneaking suspicion that it became so narrow up ahead that most people couldn't squeeze through the gap. He moved further along and started to make out different colors in the glow. Sometimes it even seemed to be moving. A reflection on water, perhaps. When he reached the end of the path, he was shocked to see a pile of bones and almost jumped when something small ran over his boot. He looked around and saw a small creature with a long tail dart away into the darkness. Probably a rat, he mused to himself. He looked down at the bones and noticed small teeth marks, but there was something strange about them. They had made an odd pattern, a coincidence. Jimmy Swift shook his head. It never helped to gawk too long if you planned to take something. He looked at the gap. It was narrow, but he would be able to easily slip through it. Being kicked out of towns tended to make one skinny, and Jimmy Swift had been kicked out of a lot of towns. He turned himself sideways and squeezed into the gap. It became wider a little further ahead. The tingling noise seemed like music now. There was a sudden loud crunch. Jimmy Swift looked down as best as he could, but he couldn't make out what it was he stepped on. He continued forwards and could hear the gurgling of a stream. He finally made it the end of the narrow passage and looked out into the cavern ahead. He could see them. The glowing flowers were real. The gap before him was incredibly narrow, but he managed to squeeze himself through it, though it tore his shirt a little. He gazed in wonder at the cavern before him. The flowers were everywhere. He bent down to look at one. The petals were made of a pinkish gemstone he didn't know the name of, but at the center was a bright red ruby. He tapped it with his fingernail, and the tingling music seemed to intensify and grow annoyed for a second. Jimmy Swift blinked. He had never heard of annoyed music before. He walked up to the pool and looked in. The pool swirled and rippled with colors, the shimmering reflections of the light on the water casting a wide spectrum all over the cave like a net. He thought he could see small creatures in the pool darting about, but it was too hard to make out through the glowing glare. He saw larger flowers ahead, but when he moved towards them, he hit something solid. He was so unprepared that it knocked him flat on his bottom. He got up with a groan only to be knocked back again. He kicked out. The mark of his boot seemed to hang in the air in front of him. He reached out and touched it. The music did. Its annoyed chime again. Jimmy then noticed that it was a crystal so clear that it was almost invisible. The bright glare of the flowers made it difficult to spot. He brushed himself off and stood up, spreading his hands before him as though he was walking in the dark. He noticed more of these crystal rocks. They were scattered about the cavern. There was also more of the crunching noise with each footstep. He looked down, but could only see glowing white roots from the flowers and some dull petals. They cracked under his boots with each step. He moved onwards, looking down to protect his eyes from the glare and using his hands. It was like an invisible maze. After a while he looked up and noticed he was on the other side of the pool, though he couldn't tell how he had got there. He could see his footprints, but they didn't make any sense. Some would end abruptly, only to appear in another place. Jimmy Swift let out a low groan. It must be the curse. He scanned around for the largest flower he could find. He made his way over to it and examined it. The stem was of a shining gold hue, and the petals were large and thick. He then noticed that the petals were vibrating, and the tingling music seemed to grow more agitated. He delicately lifted the flower out of the earth, making sure to take its ivory-white roots with it, then placed it gently in his pocket next to the coin. As his fingers brushed the coin, he became aware of a low moaning sound echoing around the cave. Jimmy Swift, who earned his name, decided to run. He turned back and ran, bumping into the crystal-clear rocks as he did so. He could hear a heavy thudding and crunching behind him. He let out a shout, which was soon met by another noise. It might have been an echo, but it was too hard to tell. He looked around and noticed a distorted man. His limbs didn't seem right, and his body seemed to ripple. Jimmy screamed and tried to back away. The man raised his arms and let out a howl, reaching for him as it did so. Jimmy Swift ducked down and hit the dirt, the bright ivory roots and dead flower petals crunching beneath him. That might knock the sense back into him. He followed the path-crunched petals, the shards cutting into his palms. He ignored the pain and crawled as fast as he could. He could hear the grunts and breathing of the distorted man. Jimmy Swift had been in this moment before. The chase. Eyes on the path in front of you. Ignore any pain and always shove past the smallest person in a crowd. The distorted man wouldn't be able to run that fast. His body was all wrong. Jimmy Swift didn't want to think about it. He found the gap he came through as it was the darkest place in the room. He squeezed his body into the narrow gap, feeling skin peel from his body. Ignoring it, he continued sideways. Catching a glance of the distorted man, he was thin, and his body seemed to be shifting. Jimmy Swift kept to his motto and pressed onwards, not caring if the distorted man was able to follow him or not. He managed to pass through the narrow gap with only a few more cuts. He almost tripped as he squeezed back out into the darkness. He could see the sky at the exit of the cave. The stars were out now. He sprinted for the cave mouth, the sounds of the distorted man already fading behind him. He looked back, but couldn't see anything. There was a cold wind blowing as he ventured back into the abandoned village. He grabbed a branch with leaves on it and used them to cover his tracks. The worst part wasn't over. He may have escaped the distorted man, but he couldn't leave the town. It was far too dark, and the creatures of the night would be out. He would have to spend the night in the least likely spot if he wanted to make it to morning. He made his way to the pub with the caved-in roof, found a small hiding spot in the rubble. Only then did he make sure to check that the flower had come to any harm. It hadn't, and it seemed to glow more radiantly now. He quickly hid it away, fearing its glow might attract the distorted man. As he did so, he remembered the coin he had found before. His mind drifted back to all the times he had much more coins in his pockets, all the times spent just a little too tipsy in pubs better than this one. It was always fun until you were no longer the center of attention, or the town guards showed up and you no longer wanted any attention. His thieving and indulgence had got him kicked out of every town. He thought for a long time, where would he go? No one in the region would want anything to do with him. A publicly known thief wasn't a very good one after all. And the flower? Sure, it was valuable. But when he thought about it, who could he sell it to? When the sun rose, Jimmy Swift looked around, making sure no one was in the village, especially not a distorted man. Thinking back on the events of the previous night made him wonder if it was a dream. Then he reached for the flower. It felt more brittle than before, but it was there. It had been real. He no longer wanted to sell it. He wanted to find a safe place for it and plant it. Then see where life took him from there.